The air on the island was thick with humidity and burnt gunpowder. Palm leaves hung motionless. A group of captured Japanese women nurses, some barely 20, were ordered to line up beside the trench. American boots crunched against coral sand. A voice rose above the buzz of flies. Calm, firm, impossible to misinterpret. "Close your eyes," the Marine said. Then, after a pause that could split the soul and kneel, no one moved. The women's faces glistened with sweat and dust, their hands trembling around the small bundles they'd carried from the field hospital. Behind them, the ocean hissed against rocks, slow, steady, cruel. They had heard what the propaganda films back home had promised. Americans never take prisoners. To kneel was to die. The sergeant's shadow fell across them. He was young, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his helmet, his rifle angled down. "Do it," he said again. A few obeyed. The rest followed, sand grinding into their knees, eyes squeezed shut, breath held, waiting for the shot. Reports later said there were about 30 Japanese women captured on that island in 1945, part of the thousands who served in military medical units across the Pacific. For these women, surrender was shame worse than death. They had been told to die before capture. One nurse whispered a prayer. Another clenched her jaw to hide her tears. The seconds stretched so long that time itself felt suspended. A mosquito whined near someone's ear. A boot shifted, metal clicked, and then nothing, no shots, only the slow shuffle of men moving closer. One woman dared to open her eyes a fraction, and what she saw didn't fit her world. The American soldier was kneeling too, his weapon slung over his shoulder, a small pouch of medical supplies in his hand. Her breath hitched. She thought it was some trick before the execution, but then she saw his hands steady, careful, as he reached for her wounded arm. In that instant, terror turned into confusion. Everything she had been taught was cracking apart, one heartbeat at a time. The women remained kneeling, eyes wide open now, watching as the unthinkable began to unfold. The Americans weren't here to kill them. The silence was about to break. Every breath felt heavier than the last. The captured nurses still knelt in the sand, eyes lowered, the taste of salt and fear thick in their throats. The American soldiers hadn't spoken again. Boots shifted in the dust. The sound of metal buckles clicking made one woman flinch. She thought it was the last thing she'd ever hear. Then came a single command, softer this time. "Stay still." It wasn't a threat. It was something else. An order meant to protect, not punish. One Marine lowered his rifle. Another took off his helmet and waved his hand toward the medics waiting behind him. The women didn't understand. When a shadow fell across one nurse's shoulder, she tensed, expecting the cold barrel of a gun. Instead, she felt a hand, gloved, steady, rest gently on her arm. She dared to open her eyes. The man before her wasn't aiming at her. He was crouched, opening a small green pouch. The metallic snap of its clasp echoed in the still air. Inside, gauze, iodine, bandages. The nurses' confusion deepened. They had imagined this moment so many times in training, that capture meant humiliation or torture. Yet here, in the fading gold of the Pacific sunset, the supposed enemy was cleaning a wound. In those seconds, the entire weight of wartime propaganda began to crack. None of them had heard of the Geneva Convention. Back home, officers told them Americans killed captives on sight. But in 1944, Allied forces had already formalized strict codes of treatment for prisoners of war. These Marines weren't following mercy, they were following procedure. rules born from civilization amid chaos. One of the women, voice trembling, whispered in Japanese, "Why?" No one answered. The medic only said, "Hold still," and tied the bandage tighter. For the first time since the surrender, the women dared to breathe. The absence of violence was louder than any explosion. Still, the fear didn't vanish. It turned into disbelief. Were they being prepared for interrogation? For something worse? Their minds wrestled with meaning, trying to fit this kindness into the pattern of cruelty they'd been taught. And as the last light faded, a strange calm filled the trench. The women no longer expected death, but they still didn't understand life under enemy mercy. The real shock was about to come. What the Americans did next would defy everything they believed possible. The antiseptic sting hit first. Sharp, chemical, alien. One Japanese nurse hissed under her breath as the American medic dabbed iodine on her arm. The liquid glowed orange against dirt, caked skin, a strange symbol of care in a place built for killing. Around them, the air smelled of sweat, salt water, and burned canvas from the wrecked field tents nearby. Flies gathered, drawn by the faint sweetness of blood. The medics worked in silence, sleeves rolled, hands steady. A few Marines stood guard, rifles pointed at the ground, not at the women. That detail alone was enough to send shivers through the group. For the first time, they saw the Americans up close. Broad shoulders, sunburned necks, eyes rimmed red from fatigue, but no cruelty in their movements. A young corpsman looked barely older than the prisoners themselves. When he reached for a nurse's wrist to check her pulse, she flinched, expecting a blow. He only said, "It's okay, you're safe." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Instead of bullets, there was iodine. Instead of shouting, there was patience. Records from the Pacific Campaign note that U.S. field hospitals treated well over 100,000 enemy prisoners, Japanese, Korean, and even German soldiers captured in the region. For the medics, it wasn't about pity, it was about protocol. Wounds got cleaned, fever got checked, orders got followed. One of the women whispered, "They treat us before themselves." It wasn't exaggeration. Some Marines had bandaged the nurses first, even though their own men lay bleeding nearby. To the Americans, that was duty. To the prisoners, it was incomprehensible. Each movement became a tiny act of rebellion against everything those nurses had been told to believe. The smell of medicine replaced the scent of death. The sound of waves merged with the soft rhythm of bandages tightening. For one surreal moment, the scene looked almost peaceful, but that calm carried danger, the collapse of certainty. These women had spent years believing that capture meant dishonor, that mercy was weakness, that enemies were monsters. Yet the monsters were saving them, and as the last wound was wrapped and the medics stepped back, something deeper began to shift. Doubt, wonder, the slow crumble of faith in a system that demanded death over surrender. The next realization would hit even harder. Everything they'd been taught about Americans was about to fall apart completely. They had grown up on stories that painted Americans as beasts, men who mutilated prisoners, who laughed while killing. That belief had been burned into them through radio speeches, posters, and training films. But now, sitting bandaged beneath a torn canvas shelter, the Japanese nurses stared at the men who'd just saved their lives. They were eating from tin mess kits, not snarling, not gloating, just tired, human, and strangely quiet. One of the women whispered, "This isn't possible." Another added, "Our officers said they would burn us alive." Neither voice carried anger, only confusion. As the night deepened, an interpreter arrived, a nice soldier from California, fluent in both English and Japanese. He spoke gently, explaining what was happening. They were prisoners of war, not condemned captives. They would be taken to a medical camp, treated, fed, and questioned, not executed. The women sat frozen. They couldn't process the idea that surrender might still mean survival. In those years, surrender for Japanese troops was almost unthinkable. Reports indicate that before 1944, fewer than 1 in 100 Japanese soldiers ever gave themselves up. They fought to the death, but by 1945, after word spread of captured soldiers being treated humanely, that number rose to roughly 8 in 100. It was a silent revolution triggered not by speeches, but by moments exactly like this one. The interpreter noticed their disbelief and said softly, "The war is ending soon. You will go home." For a few seconds no one breathed. The word home had become a myth, a sound without shape. One nurse covered her face and began to sob, not from pain, but from the realization that everything she'd believed about her enemy, about herself, was collapsing in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. Her friend touched her shoulder, whispering, "If they are not monsters, then what are we?" It was not a question meant to be answered. It was a wound deeper than any bullet could cause. The Americans didn't argue or explain. They simply handed out water and bread, saying nothing. Mercy itself became the argument. As dawn began to rise, the trucks rolled in to move the captives to a new camp. The engines rumbled, echoing through the palms, and the women braced themselves once again, uncertain what awaited them beyond those barbed gates. The trucks rolled through palm-lined dirt roads, engines growling in the heavy tropical air. The Japanese nurses sat in the back, clutching their knees, too afraid to speak. Every bump in the path jolted their bones and thoughts alike. In their minds, POW camp meant cages, humiliation, maybe execution by morning. When the convoy finally stopped, the women blinked against the harsh afternoon light. Before them stood not a prison, but a strange, organized village. Rows of tents stretched across the clearing, each marked with a red cross. Smoke rose from cooking pits. American soldiers moved in quiet efficiency, unloading crates and filling canteens. It didn't make sense. This wasn't how enemies treated captives in the stories they'd been told. A corporal shouted instructions, and the women were guided toward a check-in table. The interpreter from earlier reappeared, smiling faintly, motioning for them to follow. A medic handed each woman a small paper tag with a number on it. They were logged, medically screened, and offered clean water. A few refused at first, still expecting poison. But when one nurse took a sip and didn't collapse, the rest followed. Then came the shock that broke them completely. Food. A line of soldiers ladled steaming stew into tin bowls, along with slices of bread and even canned peaches. The scent alone made one woman dizzy. For months they had survived on scraps of rice and salt fish. Now, in the custody of their enemy, they were being fed like guests. Records from that period show that the average daily ration for prisoners of war in American custody reached about 2,700 calories, astonishingly higher than what most civilians in wartime Japan received. For many of these women, it was the first full meal in weeks. One of them whispered, "This cannot be real." Another murmured, "They feed us better than our own officers did." The guards didn't mock their disbelief. They simply pointed toward the medical tent for checkups. Every gesture seemed rehearsed in kindness. Every rule enforced without cruelty, But that gentleness only deepened the confusion. If the Americans weren't monsters, what did that make the world they'd been serving? As evening fell, a new group approached across the camp, women in crisp uniforms, faces lined with exhaustion but warmth. American nurses, and when their eyes met those of the captured Japanese nurses, the real transformation began. The first time they saw them, it felt like looking into a mirror distorted by war. American nurses' hair tucked under caps, white bands on their sleeves, eyes ringed with fatigue, walked toward the Japanese prisoners, carrying buckets of water and clean towels. The Japanese nurses froze. Their hands still trembled from the shock of survival, unsure whether to salute, bow, or hide. The lead American nurse, a woman barely in her mid-20s, set down the buckets and gestured kindly toward a small washing area beside the tent. "You can clean up here," she said softly. The interpreter translated. The Japanese nurses hesitated, still convinced this must be some elaborate deception. But when one woman stepped forward, the Americans didn't stop her. They waited, patient. Soon, the sound of water replaced the hum of fear. Mud and dried blood ran off pale wrists, down into the sand. One American nurse took off her gloves and helped untangle a Japanese woman's hair, gently pouring water over it from a canteen. The motion was so intimate, so human, that it broke something invisible. For the first time since capture, one of the Japanese nurses laughed, a soft, embarrassed sound that startled everyone, even herself. The American nurse smiled back. They didn't share a language, but they shared exhaustion, compassion, and the same scars from tending to men who screamed in pain. By 1945, the U.S. Army Nurse Corps had grown to more than 50, 9,000 women, many deployed across the Pacific. Their duty was to treat anyone wounded, regardless of uniform. That principle, printed in every field manual, was now unfolding in real life before these prisoners' eyes. One Japanese nurse whispered, "She could have been me." Her words carried no bitterness, only recognition. Both women had chosen the same path in different uniforms, trained to heal, sent to the front, used by empires that saw them as tools. As evening shadows lengthened, the women sat together beneath the same tarpaulin, trading hesitant smiles and glances. A few shared bandages, others shared silence. For a moment, the lines between victor and captive blurred into something fragile but beautiful. Yet beneath that fragile peace, guilt stirred. The Japanese nurses remembered the propaganda they once repeated, the hatred they once believed. Now that hatred was dissolving right in front of them, and with it, a haunting question was about to rise in the night. The camp grew quiet after lights out. Crickets chirped beyond the wire fence, and somewhere a generator hummed like a distant heartbeat. The Japanese nurses lay awake on their cots, staring at the tent's ceiling, the day's images replaying endlessly, the smiles, the shared washing, the impossible kindness. For the first time, fear wasn't keeping them awake. Guilt was. It began with a whisper. One of the younger nurses sat up, unable to carry the silence any longer. "There are things we did," she murmured in Japanese. The interpreter, sitting nearby with a notebook, looked up from his post. She met his eyes and continued, voice trembling. "Things no one should have done in the name of loyalty." Her confession tumbled out stories of field hospitals where wounded American airmen had been denied care, of patients left to die because officers forbade wasting supplies on enemies. The interpreter's pencil moved quietly, no judgment in his eyes, only attention. The other nurses listened in frozen stillness. When she stopped speaking, another voice picked up, then another. By midnight, half the tent had joined in a quiet chain of remorse echoing under the canvas roof. Some cried softly, others just stared into the dark. It wasn't about absolution. It was about releasing poison that had been sitting inside them for years. After the war, Allied intelligence reports recorded more than 7,000 first-hand statements from Japanese prisoners, many of them from women. They weren't interrogations, they were outpourings. For the first time, these people were being asked what they saw, what they felt, not just what they did. The interpreter later wrote in his logbook, "She spoke like someone learning to breathe again." Outside, a guard walked past, pausing for a moment as he heard muffled sobs from the tent. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, cigarette glowing red in the dark, understanding more than his orders required. One of the nurses whispered to herself, "Maybe they listen because they don't hate us." The words sounded unreal, even to her own ears. By the time dawn crept through the canvas flaps, the confessions had run dry, but something had shifted forever. The women weren't just captives anymore. They were witnesses, finally seen. And one of those witnesses, the Marine who stood outside that night, would soon find himself writing a letter that changed everything. The young Marine who'd stood watch that night couldn't shake what he'd heard. The confessions still echoed in his head. The trembling voices, the tears muffled under the hum of crickets. By sunrise, he sat on an ammo crate behind the tents, cigarette between his fingers, trying to put his thoughts into words. He pulled out a small, dirt-stained notebook and began to write home. "They aren't what we were told," he scribbled. "The enemy cries like us, bleeds like us. Maybe we were both just following orders." For weeks he had guarded these women with the same detachment he used at the front lines. But that night, hearing their guilt and pain stripped something raw inside him. These weren't monsters, they were medics, healers who'd been caught between duty and deception. He remembered one nurse's shaking hands as she spoke, how her words didn't sound rehearsed or strategic. They sounded human. In official records, historians later found hundreds of letters like his, notes from American soldiers who confessed confusion more than hatred. U.S. mail censorship logs show that morale didn't just shift with victories or losses. It shifted when soldiers began to empathize with their prisoners. Empathy, it turned out, was contagious. The Marine looked up as the camp stirred awake. The same nurse who had spoken first the night before stepped out of her tent. She carried a bucket of water, eyes still red but shoulders straighter. For a moment their gazes met. She gave a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement that both had heard each other's truths in the dark. He nodded back, unsure why. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was guilt, maybe both. Later that day, he was reassigned to the medical station, helping distribute supplies. When he placed a tin of food beside her cot, she bowed slightly, whispering something he didn't understand. The interpreter translated. She says, "Thank you for listening." He swallowed hard. No training manual had prepared him for that. That night, under a dim lantern, he wrote again in his notebook, "If war can make enemies kneel, mercy can make them stand." Those words wouldn't leave him for the rest of his life, and soon he would witness something that would haunt every survivor of that island. The overwhelming, impossible scale of America's power. The next morning, a low rumble rolled across the camp, not thunder, but engines. Convoys of trucks appeared on the horizon. weaving through palm trees like a mechanical tide. Each was stacked with wooden crates stamped in bold black letters. USA. The Japanese nurses gathered near the fence, watching in silence as soldiers unloaded the cargo. Crates of medical supplies, jerry cans, tinned food, soap, mosquito netting, an avalanche of resources. Forklifts clattered. Tarpaulins flapped. It looked less like a camp resupply and more like a moving factory. One prisoner whispered, "How much can they possibly have?" No one answered. A sergeant pried open a box and pulled out bars of soap, handing them to the American nurses. "For the POW," he said. The Japanese women exchanged bewildered glances. Soap was a luxury in their homeland now, rarer than gold. Here, it was stacked in piles taller than a man. The interpreter quietly explained, "They have ships that bring more every week." The women didn't believe him until they saw another line of trucks rumbling in. It wasn't arrogance that stunned them, it was scale. America had turned its war machine into an engine of endless production. By the end of the conflict, the United States would have built nearly 300,000 aircraft, more than 80,000 tanks, and over 6 million tons of food rations. Numbers too vast to fit in the imagination of a country that was rationing rice by the grain. One nurse murmured, "We could never have one." It wasn't defeatism, it was clarity. The sight of those supplies was more devastating than any bombing raid. They realized then that Japan hadn't lost on the battlefield. It had lost in the factories, in the shipyards, in the sheer ability to outproduce hunger and despair. A Marine handed a Japanese nurse a clean towel, fresh from the shipment. He said with a grin. She took it with trembling hands, the scent of machine oil still clinging to the fabric. For a moment she could almost hear the echo of the factory where it was made thousands of miles away, somewhere in a world that never stopped working. That day, the women didn't just see America's power, they felt it. And that feeling would plant a seed far deeper than fear, humility. Because the next stage of their captivity wasn't about power at all. It was about what came after mercy. It was about going home. Weeks passed. The air grew cooler as the monsoon season waned, and rumors began to ripple through the camp. Some prisoners would soon be released. The Japanese nurses didn't believe it at first. Freedom had become an idea too fragile to trust. But then, one morning, they were handed folded uniforms, simple cloth dresses, and small notebooks stamped Repatriation, Identification. It was real. The Americans lined them up beside the trucks again. This time there were no rifles pointed at them, only clipboards and farewell gestures. The same Marine who once shouted, "Close your eyes and kneel," now helped them climb aboard. No hatred, no power games, just quiet formality. The nurses clutched their notebooks like sacred relics. Inside, each page carried their name, serial number, and a few lines of medical clearance. Yet to them those small booklets felt heavier than any medal. They meant survival. The interpreter explained their route. The prisoners would travel to a coastal base, then board ships bound for Japan. "You'll be home within weeks," he said. That single word home carried more weight than any sermon. As the trucks rumbled toward the docks, the women stared at the endless procession of American vehicles, cranes, and ships loading supplies for other fronts. The scale of it still stunned them. One whispered, "Even now, they build more while we go home." At the port, the women were guided toward a ship-gray hull, white lettering, Red Cross flag fluttering in the sea wind. The American nurses stood on the pier, handing out small care packages, toothbrushes, canned fruit, bandages. When one Japanese nurse accepted hers, she froze. Inside was a folded note, "Go home safe." She looked up, eyes wet, searching for who had written it, but the crowd was already shifting. The horn blared, signaling departure. As the ship began to move, the women stood at the rail. One turned and saw the same Marine waving from the dock. She lifted her hand in return, tears streaking her sunburned face. Official records show that more than 35,000 Japanese prisoners were repatriated by 1947. But statistics couldn't capture what was happening in that moment. Two enemies, waving goodbye as if they'd shared a lifetime. For one nurse, that wave would live forever etched in the final pages of her diary. The same diary that would one day be found in a dusty Tokyo archive 2 decades later, in the heart of Tokyo. An archivist slid open a forgotten metal drawer and found a notebook wrapped in fading cloth. The edges were brittle, the ink smudged by salt and time. On the first page, written in neat, deliberate strokes, were 6 words: "Close your eyes, Neil, live." It was the diary of one of those captured nurses, its pages filled during her weeks in the American POW camp. Inside, she described not just survival, but transformation. The handwriting shifted across chapters, uneven and panicked at first, calm and rounded by the end. She had written about the moment she expected execution, and instead found mercy. She wrote about the first bowl of stew that tasted like forgiveness. She wrote about the American nurse who washed her hair and the Marine who listened without judgment. The archivist turned the pages slowly, realizing he was holding a ghost story that didn't end in death. In post-war Japan, the 1960s were an era of reflection. Memoirs from former soldiers and POW began surfacing, works that quietly dismantled wartime propaganda. The diary became part of that wave. Its publication caused quiet outrage at first, then tears. Readers couldn't ignore the simplicity of its truth. The war had dehumanized both sides, but in that camp, humanity had won one small battle. A historian who later analyzed the diary wrote, "Her faith in mercy was born from her enemy's discipline." That line spread across newspapers, quoted in speeches, taught in ethics courses. But for the author herself, the meaning was simpler. In her final entry, she wrote, "We lost everything, but not our chance to change." The diary now rests behind glass in a Tokyo museum, its paper yellowed, the words faint. Tourists walk past without knowing the scent of iodine or the sound of ocean waves behind those sentences. But if they stop and read, they'll see a truth more enduring than any weapon compassion can rewrite memory. She had once obeyed an order meant for death. Close your eyes and kneel. Yet because a stranger chose mercy, she walked away and taught others to live differently. The war ended long ago, but her words still breathe. They remind us that even in the darkest machinery of conflict, one unexpected act of humanity can outlast empires.